Hello, my name is Andy from Nummech Products. This video is a brief overview of the installation process on our autococker grip frames, which you can see right here. Currently we have two different versions, a slider frame and a hinge frame. These two frames will fit on a full-length style autococker body, such as this one. Won't fit on a mini body and won't fit on a Empire or Resurrection or Sniper style body, which use a different system. This video doesn't go over any of the deep disassembly or maintenance for the frames. We have other information for that on our website and possibly other videos. So this is just for how to install the frame on the body and some basic tuning. The video will be pretty quick because the process is basically similar to using a typical autococker frame, such as this one. This I took off this marker body, so I'm going to toss that aside. Okay, so let's do a quick overview of the items that you receive with the new grip frame. They come essentially all ready to go, again with some minor tuning that's necessary, but you won't have to do a whole lot of modification to the parts. This right here is a slider frame, which you can see is slide trigger, and over here we have the hinge frame. The internals for the regulator and the ASA and the foregrip are identical. The only main difference is the trigger setup. This is a slightly different system that uses a thinner slot for the slide plate, whereas the hinge frame has a larger slot for a larger trigger, and it uses some different springs and different hardware. But again, the regulator, ASA, foregrip, and the sear itself is the same between the two. So when you receive the frame, you will have all those parts assembled, with the minor exception of some of the foregrips. Again, this depends on the exact configuration of parts that you purchase as to whether or not the foregrip is attached. In this case, this is our default style foregrip, the milled 3-finger version. But we have many other versions, and we also have other accessories such as this foregrip extender, and we also have a wedge. So before I put this on, I would like to just go over some of the main changes that have to do with the foregrip, because those parts are universal between all the frames. In the foregrip, it's being held on using this. Two of these actually. It's a little tiny stainless steel screw that has an O-ring around the head, which probably isn't in focus, but you can just trust me. So this screw is located down inside the top of the vertical adapter area, here and here. So if you were to purchase one of these accessories, such as this extender, all you have to do is unbolt those screws, slide the extender on there, and then attach the foregrip to the extender itself. Now, there's pressure located inside here because this is basically the vertical adapter section of the frame. That's why the screws have little O-rings around the heads, because they have to seal the pressure. So any screws you have going in or out of this area, which includes this vertical adapter screw that's sticking through there, those all have to have O-rings around the heads. But screws that go on the mounting plate attaching to the foregrip on the end don't need O-rings. Those are just basic screws like these, which will fit down inside like that. So a foregrip will attach to that, and it's basically that easy. So assuming you don't have to do any modifications to the foregrips or anything like that, the frame will arrive to you basically ready to go. It'll have all the internals installed, the trigger, the frame, the sear, all that stuff. There will be some minor things you have to do before you install it though, and that's what this bag is for. We call this the hardware pack. This includes some new screws and some new O-rings, which you have to install on the frame. So I'm going to open this up right now, and we can see what you get. Take everything out. So you have a couple screws and a couple O-rings. I'm going to put the O-rings down and talk about those in a second. The reason I want to talk about the screws right now, these two button head screws, those go on the frame. One of them is located right in front of the trigger. It's a slightly longer one, and then the slightly shorter one goes on the back. You should see them poke out a little bit more than 1/8 of an inch. That's normal. Now, in this particular hardware pack that I already opened up, there was an additional screw. This is a vertical adapter screw, which has an O-ring around the head. You may have noticed earlier, let me poke at it. There we go. You may have noticed earlier that this frame already had a vertical adapter screw pre-installed. We pre-install the vertical adapter screw if possible. If it doesn't come pre-installed in there, then it'll be inside the hardware pack. But as long as we can put it in there and not have it fall out in shipment, then we'll do that. So this screw that you see sticking out, the vertical adapter screw, it has that O-ring around the head, which again, that has to seal the vertical adapter area of the body. So before you install the frame on the marker, be sure you have the screw there. If not, then you have to install it. There's a hole in the bottom of the foregrip of all of the different foregrips we make. So you just insert it up there and then screw it into position. But again, be sure it has the O-ring around the head. So this screw you might not receive spare, it might be pre-installed. For the purposes of the video, I'm just going to set it aside. This is essentially ready to be mounted once you install the new seals, which were also inside that hardware pack. There's only 2 O-rings, a big one and a small one. The top of the frame has some areas that are milled to accept the O-rings. Let me try to get light to hit it. There we go. So the smaller O-ring goes right here, right next to the trigger. That seals a vertical air port that goes up through the frame. And then the larger O-ring seals the vertical adapter. So, oops, grip frame screws fall out. So, vertical adapter screw, just a size 15. I'm going to install that right here. So it might pop out, just because of the friction, it might not hold it in position. But I just pushed it down into the frame. The smaller O-ring, which is a metric O-ring, again, that goes right behind the trigger. So now, again, these might pop out. I'm going to hope they don't pop out and show them to you. There's the smaller O-ring is installed right there, and the larger one is right there on the vertical adapter. So this is ready to go. At this point, I had already removed the frame from this body. I took out both screws for the grip frame because they're going to be in the way when I go to slide this on. The grip frame is ready to go. So I'm going to guide in the linkage and slide it up into position. Now you have to make sure that none of those O-rings got pinched. The frame should fit flush up against the bottom of the body like that. You shouldn't be able to see any O-rings poking out left side or right side. So I think it's okay. I forgot to get out the Allen key, so I'm going to set this down carefully and get out a 1/8 Allen key. And then vertical adapter screw, we use a 3/16. So those are the 2 I need to use. The shorter of the 2 button head screws goes in the back. So I'm going to just very lightly tighten that down. And then the longer screw goes in the front. And again, this is the same between the slider frame or the hinge frame. They use the same screws to mount, so it doesn't matter which version you have. On the slider frame, you have to hold the trigger back a little bit so you can actually get in there and tighten this. But once you do that, it should be good. And now the one screw that's remaining is the vertical adapter screw, which you can see got pushed out a little bit. So I'm going to insert a 3/16 Allen key and then tighten that up. So the vertical adapter screw has an O-ring around the head, so you don't want to over tighten it because you're really just going to be squishing down on that O-ring. So just snug it a little bit like that. And now I'm going to go back and fully tighten the 2 frame screws, again just by snugging them like that. One thing to take note is that if you're using our angled foregrip wedge that's mounted like this, if you're using this, you actually have to use a ball-rounded Allen key. The reason for that is because the Allen key has to go up at an angle and then tighten that vertical adapter screw. So if it's straight, then you can use any type of Allen key as long as it's the right size, 3/16. But if you're using that angle wedge, you have to have a ball-rounded Allen key. But that's the only consideration you have to deal with those. So basically, this is ready to go. There's one other thing that I need to discuss though, and that is the very small pin valve depressor that's located in the bottom of the ASA. You can see there's a little brass piece right there. We build these frames so that they're compatible with all tanks, including tanks that use different types of valves, like the Ninja tanks, they use a ball valve. It may be necessary for you to actually take out this component and shorten it slightly, depending on the style of pin valve you have. When you insert your tank, you should be able to unthread the knob about 1.5 turns, so there'd be a small gap in there, and that should be the point where your tank valve gets engaged. It shouldn't be anywhere closer to the front, because the problem is when it gets engaged like this, it's going to leak out the bottom hole. You don't want that to happen. It's designed so that you can engage it and it's already sealed up. So ideally, just a very small amount for opening the pin valve is all that's necessary to get that tank on there. So again, if you have a Ninja ball valve, then you probably won't have to make any changes to this component. But if you have a different tank, such as a Crossfire tank or an older Ninja that uses a pin valve instead of a ball valve, or basically any other tank, then you may have to take that component out and make a couple changes to it, which I'm going to go over here in a second. Get out the proper Allen key, 3/32 inch. So on the bottom of the ASA, you can see there's a small silver screw. This is a screw that's holding in that little pin valve opener piece inside the ASA. So in order to remove that from the back, you have to remove that small silver screw first. So I'm just going to pop that out and set it down. Don't lose it. Now, with that out, I'm going to unscrew this knob. And you can see in the front of the ASA is the front of that brass component, and it's also visible in the back. So I'm just going to gently push it out from the front. Don't try to push it forward, only push it backward. You can see it just popped out. So if I go like that, it should come right out, and there it is. Now, the shortening process is pretty easy to do. All you need is a metal file, and you just got to rub it on there a little bit. I'm probably going to throw up a picture that shows one of the pin valves that's been shortened slightly. The difference is very, very, very small. So what I recommend you do is rub the brass pin valve piece on the file a couple times, and then clean it all off, make sure there's no metal dust anywhere, and then install it and try again. Don't just sit there and rub on it forever like a hamster and try to remove a bunch of material, because you probably get it to the point where this won't even open a tank at all. And then once that happens, you got to buy a new one from us. So be very careful when you make permanent adjustments like that, because once you go too far, you won't be able to put material back on. So now that you've modified the pin valve depressor, it's time to reinstall it back in the frame. For that, there's a couple things you have to be careful about. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to reinstall this ASA knob on the front. This will give you something to push against. Now, just to go over some of the theory on how this works, move this hardware aside. There's an adjustment located on the bottom of the ASA housing for an Allen key to be inserted up in, and that adjusts the regulator's output. So because of that, the pin valve has a slot that's been machined in there, and that allows this Allen key to pass up through the center of it, like this. So when you reinstall the brass piece, you must keep that slot vertical. It has to be like this. It cannot be like this. Before you install it, put some grease around these O-rings, and then grip it in such a way that the slot is vertical with the marker, and then simply reinstall it like that. And you can tip the marker upside down, and you can see, you're not going to be able to see in the video, but you can see the, well, maybe I can do it. No, I can't see it. So yeah, anyway, in real life, you'll be able to see the pin valve be pushed forward, and you're going to want to push it all the way up. You should see the empty slot through those holes. And if you take an 1/8 inch Allen key, you should be able to feed that down through. You might have to wiggle it around a little bit, but it should go through about that deep, which is about 3/4 of an inch, or maybe 1.5 centimeters. So if it stops right at the very lip of the ASA, that means the pin valve is not in the right orientation. You'll have to adjust it. But you should be able to look through these holes and see there's no brass underneath. There's no yellow brass. So as long as the path is clear inside those holes, take that small lock screw that you removed earlier and insert it into the hole and then thread it into position. Now as you thread it in, it should just slip right through the threads. There shouldn't be any resistance at all. So it should be just this easy. If you encounter resistance in trying to install it, then just stop right there, because chances are something is not in position. And that thing is the pin valve depressor located in the back. You'll have to take it out, turn it so that it's actually correct, and push it back in. Just tighten this hand tight, just like that. It's not going to come out on its own. And it should be flush with the bottom of the ASA. You shouldn't see a screw head sticking up. So this screw will keep that brass piece aligned correctly, and then you'll be able to make adjustments in the future. Now that you have the frame mounted and theoretically if your tank has been installed and you're ready to go, you now have to do some adjustments to your marker's timing for the sear and for the three-way. But you have to get it pressurized first. So for that, we have included some things that should help the process. One of these is this little 1/8 MPT plug that's located on the side of the frame. It's marked with the word test. What that is it's basically just connected directly to the output of the regulator, and that's a spot where you can take a pressure gauge like this one and install it temporarily on the side of the grips, and then use that to make adjustments to the frame. Now you can't play with it with a pressure gauge sticking out the side. This is just meant for doing pressure testing only, but it should allow you to completely rebuild the regulator at any point in the future, readjust it, reset it up. During our assembly process, we will preset the regulator to approximately 350 psi, but it might actually be a little different on your exact marker depending on the tank you use and depending on some of the internal changes with the frame, such as how the O-ring sits over time and whether or not the regulator gets broken in. But basically that's the starting point to tune any autococker. The operating pressure range is going to depend on the type of body you're using and the type of valve and the springs and all that, but it's going to probably be somewhere between 200 and 400 psi. So when you're choosing a gauge to install, you want something that's greater than just a typical 300 psi micro gauge. You know, you want something like this. This is an Ashcroft 700 psi. This would go up about halfway during our assembly process to about 350. So the exact pressure that you need is going to depend on your exact configuration of internals. There's no way for us to predict that ahead of time. So if you initially go to test fire the marker and you get no good results at all, then perhaps you can make a small adjustment to the regulator. If that's the case, then take your 1/8 inch Allen key, feed it up through that hole, and you can see on the bottom it's engraved with instructions as to which direction will increase and decrease. If you're looking at the bottom of the frame, then going counterclockwise or anti-clockwise will increase your pressure. Make very small adjustments to it though. I'm just going to move it like 1/8 of a turn, and then I would take some more shots and see what happens. If you have to go a little bit higher, then again, go about 1/8 of a turn and take a couple shots. The regulator is sensitive, so you don't want to overpressurize it if you don't have to. There's a blow-off valve located on the opposite side of the frame, but again, because we don't know the internals you're using, this blow-off valve is set pretty high from the factory. It's set above 400 psi. So again, depending on your exact configuration, you can take a pressure gauge, install it, and then read out your pressure. And say for instance you know that your marker works really well around 350 psi. Well, if that's the case, then you can increase your output to about 400 or 425 or something, and then take a 1/8 inch Allen key and adjust your relief valve to the point where it starts to leak. If you go counterclockwise with the relief valve, then that'll decrease the pressure that forces it to leak out. So the relief valve will not come preset to every pressure out there. It's only set to a very high PSI because we don't know what you're going to be using. So it's up to you to adjust it to something that's more appropriate, but it's just an insurance feature that's available on the frame in case you need it. It's not necessarily required that you adjust it. With the new trigger frame mounted onto the marker body, you're not ready to go yet because you need to adjust the timing for the sear and for the three-way valve at the front. And depending on whether or not you switch between a hinge and a slider, you may also have to adjust the hoses. This video isn't going to go over any of that advanced autococker timing stuff, how to build a cocker from scratch. I'm not going to go over that. There's plenty of other resources for that out there already. This is just for the frame itself. So one thing I am going to discuss though is some of the trigger differences with these frames. On the slider frame, which is what I have right here, you've got two, we call them bottom ridge adjustments. One of them is located here and the other was right there. So there's two very small set screws in there that are intended to be pushing up against the bottom of the plate, which will remove the amount of wobble that it has and the amount of side-to-side slop. For that, you'll have to experiment with tightening them up and then pull the trigger a little bit, make sure it's not seized up. If you have the screws too tight, then when you pull the trigger, it might just stay back. So you'll have to experiment with that. And again, there's videos out there that describe how to go over this process. It's pretty self-explanatory though. In dealing with the hinge frame in particular, you have two adjustments. One of them is in the front of the trigger itself. This is the post travel, which shows you how far the trigger goes. And then the other adjustment is located through the bottom, and that's a pre-travel. It's going up through the frame and pushing on the back of the trigger. So when you screw this in, the trigger will climb slightly back. Now again, you'll have to time this with the frame installed on the body, but it's not too difficult. You just need to balance the firing release of the sear and where you want your actual trigger swing to be, and then how far you want the swing to be, which is all up to you. Those are the main differences between the frames. The trigger stuff is just about the only thing that's different. Well, at this point we're basically done with the installation process. I'm going to install some grips on this and then we'll be taking it out. But that's just about it. So if you have any questions, then you can feel free to ask. But again, because this video is not going into all the tiny details about building an autococker, don't be afraid to ask other people that know a lot about the internals about autocockers, because there's so many parts out there, there's so many configurations of items that you can install that trying to get everything to work with everything may take a little bit of tuning. Chances are if you have a working gun with a stock frame, then you can get a working gun with one of these frames very easily. It may take some minor adjustments to the timing, but after that you should be good to go. So with that, this video is going to come to an end. Again, if you have any questions, then you can try to ask either here or email. But aside from that, I'll see you next time. Thanks.